Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Marty Leonard, President of CAGS and Dean of Graduate Studies at Dalhousie University.
Thanks very much, Ian. Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the country. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's plenary, which is entitled Degrees of Success, Exploring the Challenges and Lived Experiences of Students and Recent Graduates and Their Entries into the Workforce. This plenary is being hosted by the Council of Canadian Academies, who've recently released a report from an expert panel on the labor market transition of PhD graduates. And we have the privilege of hearing firsthand from Dr. Elizabeth Cannon, the chair of the expert panel, and our plenary speaker today about this important and of the CAGS audience in particular, very relevant topic. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Eric Meslin, President and CEO of the Council of Canadian Academies, to say a few words and to introduce Dr. Cannon. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks very much, Marty, and thanks for the warm greeting. And thanks also to the Canadian Association of Graduate Studies for partnering with us to help bring our assessment to a wider audience, something that we always hope our work does. If you can put up the next slide, I'll just give you a quick overview of what the CCA is and how it does its work. We've been around since 2005 doing one thing, carrying out assessments of the evidence on important public policy topics, usually requested by the Government of Canada. We've done it on a diversity of issues from medical care to energy. We're an organization that, as I say, does one thing. We begin all of our work with a question. We carry out that question by bringing in top experts, usually and hopefully the best minds from around the world, and sometimes people that you will know very well from your own organization. The evidence is assessed, it goes through an extensive peer review process, and then by the end of it, we can produce it in both languages, English and French, free of charge on our website. Every assessment begins, however, with a question, and if we can get the next slide. In this case, the question was referred to us by the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, with other support from NSERC, SSHRC, and Employment and Social Development Canada. Here's what the panel was asked to answer. We call it the charge. What are the main challenges that PhD students in Canada face in transitioning to the labor market? And how do these differ by field of study? There were three sub-questions that the panel was asked to address. What unique challenges do PhD graduates working in Canada face in launching their careers within academia? What unique challenges do PhD graduates working in Canada face in launching their careers outside academia? And finally, what are the key motivations behind the migration of PhD graduates in and out of Canada? Is brain circulation simply a feature of a highly globalized, knowledge-based economy, or is it caused by a lack of opportunities for PhD graduates? So that's what the panel was asked to address. Who was the panel? Next slide, please. The expert panel on labor market transition of PhD graduates was collected from a number of expert areas of knowledge and experience. The 12 scholars and practitioners brought their knowledge of labor economics, psychology, education, sociology, university administration, and professional development, as well as the industrial sector. It included several recent PhD graduates, Tina Grosso, Brian Gopal, and Jennifer Polk in particular, who were able to speak to contemporary experiences in transitioning to the labor market following their graduation. Brian Gopal also brought a valuable perspective on the international mobility of PhD graduates. He obtained his PhD in Canada, but now works as an assistant professor at the University of Rochester in the US. Another member, Marceline Bangali, is an associate professor at the Université Laval and was able to bring a Francophone perspective as well as evidence of the PhD graduates in French Quebec universities. A great group, one that the CCA is proud of having supported and endorsed. Before, though, I pass our microphone to the featured speaker, I just wanted to make a couple of final reminder comments about the Q&A process, which we're very excited about. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A bar as you think of them, rather than waiting until the end of the session. Our team will be collecting them and identifying the ones that we hope we can answer. We'll have lots of time for discussion, but we may not get to all the questions. We can't answer every single one, but we'll do our best. It will really depend on what you want to know and what we can answer. I hope you can appreciate that the more questions, the better, but we may just not be able to get to them today. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce the panel chair, Dr. Elizabeth Cannon, who is well known to, I'm sure, many of you associated with CAGS, Emerita President of the University of Calgary, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, a scholar in innovation and policy, and one that the CCA was just delighted to have lead this expert panel. I'm going to turn it over to you, Elizabeth, with our thanks very much for offering findings and reflections on the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to present the findings and reflections on behalf of the expert panel. I know many of our panel members are part of the audience today, which is fantastic. Thank you to CAGS for hosting us and for the support from the CCA. It was a fantastic process. We're very proud of the report and delighted to be able to bring some of the findings to you today. Next slide, please. I wanted to start by laying down the context of which we are immersed in terms of graduate education and PhD education, particularly in Canada. And really, it starts from the point of view that PhD graduates bring valued skills and knowledge to a wide range of sectors in our country. We know that PhDs think creatively, they solve problems, they're very important to innovation and to developing and maintaining competitiveness, particularly as Canada moves to more knowledge-intensive industries. This is a long-standing policy priority for our country and of course many other countries as well. However, within that context, we know that many PhDs face significant challenges entering the labor market following graduation. And we're going to see some data on this in terms of where they go and some of the other factors that frankly contribute to an underutilization of PhDs in the workforce. This has given rise to very important questions for both students and Canadian society about the value of PhD training and its investment, and how to optimize students' education experiences to ensure that their contributions can be best realized to Canadian economy and society. We wanted to, as a panel, take a deep dive into the specific challenges facing Canada's PhD graduates as they transition from the university to the work environment. And the report does not contain recommendations. That is not part of the CCA process per se, but we have a number of findings, reflections, and we do hope this report sparks conversation, which is exactly the environment and platform that we have today through CAGS. This is important, and we do hope within the graduate education community, universities more broadly, government, industry, that the people take this report and see what can be done to push this forward. I will make a note as well that when the panel undertook its work, which started in May 2019, we did not look at things like COVID. So that was not considered, obviously had not arrived yet. And so some of that is not included in the report as you see presented. So at the end of the report, we hope that you'll find it's very rigorous, We're very proud of the work that has been done to frame this and some of the research and original research that is contained as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the structure of the report, it is based on meetings held by the panel, as I mentioned, started in May 2019. We met 5 times, 4 in person, 1 virtually over each of those 2 days. We had several pieces of original research that were done. We commissioned analysis from Ross Finney on the education and labor market longitudinal platform, looking at trajectory of earnings of new PhDs over the first 5 years. We also carried out original analysis looking at census data to determine the return of a PhD relative to a master's program, and I'll touch on that later. We also, of course, had the benefit of peer review. Again, thank you to the 10 experts that provided excellent feedback on drafts, which were considered in the final report. And we also, of course, in our work had looked at research, gray literature, so to speak, from a wide range of stakeholders, looking at surveys that had been done at various institutions, and of course, some of the new information that we brought to the table. We didn't want to just bring quantitative information. That is very important, but it was extremely critical to the panel that we shine a light on the lived experience of students and recent graduates. The most interesting thing about this report is for those of us who have PhDs, we all have our own story, and we wanted to capture those, and you'll see interspersed in the report about 11 stories of PhD graduates, some who have been challenged and struggled and done well, others who are still finding their way. But we wanted to capture that because I think it speaks to the complexity of the issue and not boiling down just to numbers. In chapter 2, we talk about the background and context of PhD education in Canada, the number of degrees and funding in institutions. Chapter 3 looks at current experiences and perceptions of PhD students, graduates, and postdoctoral fellows, including academic culture. Chapter 4 then starts to look at receptor capacity, looking at various sectors, higher education, private sector, and so on. Also, whether PhDs are graduating with the skills and experience that are sought by hiring managers, particularly outside the academic environment. Chapter 5 looks at the labor market outcomes of PhDs once they enter the workforce. So this is where we have a discussion of unemployment rates and salaries, looking at the economic returns of pursuing a PhD, and whether the outcomes and earnings for PhDs are different for recent graduates in comparison to other cohorts. Chapter 6 tackles part of the charge dealing with the global movement of PhDs from Canada, and including reasons why Canadian PhDs choose to stay or leave the country. Chapter 7 is really looking forward. It is capturing some of the leading practices that are already being put into place today, some of them that are done here in Canada, some of them internationally, and really trying to shine a light in 4 areas that I will talk about that are really, I think, providing some level of momentum going forward to tackle this issue. And I'll wind up by talking about some brief reflections of the panel at the end of the report. Next slide, please. So in terms of main findings, next slide, please. Wanted to start with looking at PhD graduates in Canada and how that has evolved over time. And we have seen in this country and certainly other countries that there have been significant efforts to increase our supply of highly qualified personnel and investments in research in our universities. This has been done for a number of reasons. One of them was an expected impending shortage of PhD graduates to supply the academic market. As faculty retired, we would need that next generation to come in and to fill those positions within our institutions. Secondly, was to provide industry with a workforce of innovators that would address Canada's productivity gap compared to competing jurisdictions, so tied to things like innovation and productivity. And thirdly, to supply researchers to work on university research projects. If you look at the increased investment within universities and research, PhD graduates are obviously very critical as part of those research teams to be able to contribute to the research enterprise. The challenge with the growth of PhD graduates in Canada is that there are simply not enough tenure track positions within the Academy, and I'll show you some data shortly, but also outside of the Academy, because what you would like to see as the numbers increase in PhD graduate production, that the receptor capacity is also balanced to be able to absorb those graduates. Next slide, please. This shows the number of PhD graduates over time, starting in 2002. It's the number of PhDs awarded per 10,000 of working age Canadians. And what you see is an increase just in terms of absolute numbers. In 2002, there were just over 3,700. By 2010, 6,000. And by 2017, 8,000. In fact, the number of PhD graduates per year has grown faster than the working age population in Canada, and also is higher than the growth rate for bachelor's degrees, almost double over the same time frame. However, just to put that into perspective, Canada still really ranks low relative to our OECD peers in PhD graduates. If we just compare to Australia, we have this in the report, we would have to double our number of PhD graduates to compare to where Australia is today. So yes, there's been a big increase, but we are still lagging relative to peer countries. Next slide, please. I think the interesting aspect is how has that growth in PhD graduate production balanced with the opportunities within the academic community. And this shows the number of open tenure track positions, so the number of tenure track positions in Canada over approximately the same time frame. The top dotted line shows the total number of tenure track positions, and you can see it increased but leveled out about 2008 or 9 and sits at between 40 and 41,000 tenure track. Below, the three colored lines show the rank of those faculty positions. And the one I want to focus on is the red. That is assistant professor, which is the entry level for most academic positions. You can see it increased, but had a point of inflection around 2008 or 9, and really has declined since that time. So yes, they more were brought into the system, but as they were promoted to associate and associated to full, there were not an increasing number of open assistant level positions for the increased number of PhD graduates. This is important because it shows that there is a compression in opportunities for tenure track positions for our graduates. I should also say, and we know this within the academic sector, when we go out to hire for academic appointments, it is a global search in most cases. So it's not that only PhD graduates from Canada get open tenure track positions in this country as well. You are competing in a global enterprise. So this is an important finding, I think, in terms of opportunities within the academic sector in tenure track. Next slide, please. In terms of where academic PhD graduates go, about 50% stay in higher education, about 25% in tenure track, 25% in other areas. It may be postdocs, it may be sessionals, it may be in administrative positions within our academic institutions. This is a quote particularly from a postdoctoral fellow. It says, "It's a lonely academic experience, more so than the PhD, no cohort, no association, in no man's land between faculty and students." Many PhD graduates go to a postdoc. It's expected in some disciplines to be able to take on a future academic appointment, but the data shows that's not necessarily the case. And whether it's postdocs, whether it's sessional lecturers who are teaching more frequently undergraduate courses, this creates a precarious employment situation and not feeling part of perhaps the university community as a whole. So in some case, we see the PhD graduates entering this precarious work environment, short cycles of employment, not necessarily leading to full-time employment, particularly within academic institutions. Next slide, please. So what about outside the academic environment? And what we have seen is that non-academic sectors have not significantly increased their uptake of PhD graduates. So we looked at data from several university-specific surveys, U of A, UBC, U of T McGill, the ELM-LP data that I talked about earlier, and sort of put that data together. We couldn't compare apples to apples in all cases. But looking at that, we see about 20 to 25% of PhD graduates do end up in the private sector, and the rest you can see from the chart are in public, self-employed, or not-for-profits. So what is part of the challenge here particularly is on the private sector side. And if we go to the next slide, please, I'll show a slide that's probably familiar to many of you. It is, and we used it as a proxy for industrial activity and uptake, receptor capacity for PhD graduates. And it's the gross expenditure in R&D as a percentage of GDP. And you see three lines here. The blue in the middle is the average percentage for the OECD. The yellow is the United States, and the red on the bottom is Canada. And what you can see quite markedly is that in Canada, not only did we have a relatively low GERD as a percentage of GDP in 2008, it has actually declined. So we're sitting at about 1.6 in 2000 and 1.6% in 2018, relative to say the United States, which is about 2.8%. So what this says is that Canadian expenditures in R&D are declining. And that obviously is not good news for PhD graduates who would hope to go out and to be able to contribute into knowledge intensive industries. What we see also, which is somewhat unique to Canada, is where is the R&D being conducted? We know in Canada, over 50% of the R&D expenditures occur in business, while the overall OECD average is about 70%. What that means is that for Canada, we are more heavily weighted to doing R&D within our academic institutions. Industry is at a lower level relative to other jurisdictions. So that again becomes a dynamic of their receptor capacity. We are investing less, and industry is performing a lower percentage relative to industry and other jurisdictions. So this again presents challenges as a receptor capacity for our PhD graduates. Next slide, please. In terms of the labor market outcomes of PhDs, it varies significantly by gender and discipline. And we know that the economic return of a PhD based on the data is lower for younger graduates compared to PhDs in general. We found unemployment rates among women with PhDs are higher than men across most disciplines, while women's earnings are always lower, probably in part because they more are employed in part-time positions. For PhDs working full-time, the gap between men and women is narrowing, so that's a good news. However, women are always, virtually always less than men overall. We also see that the gap between the highest and lowest incomes grows during the first 5 years. And we see that younger PhDs have similar or higher unemployment levels than those with bachelor's or master's degrees. Next slide, please. This shows the earnings growth after completing a PhD for the 2010 cohort, and it's split out by discipline. And you can see at the top, well, number one, you can see there is a huge variation across disciplines. At the top are PhDs in business. So start off much higher than other disciplines and escalates from there. Next, you see a number of, I would call sort of STEM-based disciplines that are lumped together, things like engineering, mathematics, and computer science, health and education, all whom have similar earnings. At the bottom, you see PhDs in humanities and sciences. probably because they're working in more transitional roles and a lower probability of becoming a tenure track faculty member. The differences, as I mentioned, are huge. PhDs in business earning over 80% more than graduates in humanities and sciences after 5 years. And also, for the most part, PhD graduates earn more than master's graduates in the same discipline, with a notable exception of the sciences, where PhD and master holders have approximately the same earnings trajectories over the first 5 years. Next slide, please. This continues on the work to look at the economic return of a PhD. This is defined as how much higher or lower earnings are for PhD graduates versus master's graduates. This is varying by gender, and I'll speak to each. We did exclude MBAs because they are not typically a pathway to a PhD, and it would have been distortive on the overall findings. We're only presenting the data here, not for the entire PhD population, but the population of graduates under 40. We have the entire data, of course, in the report. But if we look at the top chart, this is for men. And the gray band is where the value, the economic return of the PhD is higher than the master's. The red, it is lower. We analyzed 3 census. 2006, 2011, and 2016. When you consider the opportunity costs, that is where earnings are forgone by choosing to continue to study for a PhD rather than entering the workforce after completing a master's. For men on the top, in 2006, if you look at where that yellow line crosses from red over to gray, it took 8 years to catch up to the earnings had they stopped at a master's. If you fast forward to 2016, the red line, then it had increased to 16 years for those who could have stopped at a master's degree. So that is suggesting and showing through data that the payoff, it's taking longer to get that payoff for men than it was through 2006. On the lower chart is for women, and the dynamics are different. Women with PhDs do not start their career earning less than they would have had they started the workforce directly after a master's. So it's not for 2011 and 16 starting below in the red. And so you can see the value for women doing PhDs over a master's is there in terms of economic return. However, PhD graduates, we know, are 5 years older, entering the labor market, and not forgetting the overall earnings for women are lower than for men, regardless of degree. Next slide, please. In terms of academic culture, we found it can support or hinder the transition of PhDs to the labor market. We know the value of academic culture, which are sort of the norms and behaviors within the academic environment. It can create a community for people with shared interests, enabling them to collaborate, to learn, and develop new ideas and just share ideas. However, there are aspects of this culture that can create challenges, particularly for those who do not want to stay in academia or who have felt that they have failed in a desired academic career. We know from the data that PhD students tend to experience a higher rate of depression and anxiety than the general population. And contributing to this higher incidence of mental health issues are a sense of uselessness and emotional burnout, trying to balance the competing demands of work and personal life. We know that particularly in the sciences and some other STEM disciplines, the expectations of spending a long time in the lab, that can contribute. Whereas in the humanities and social sciences, you have factors associated with isolation in your research and in writing. These mental health issues can extend beyond graduation, creating additional challenges for PhDs as they transition to the workplace. So the whole concept of academic culture, which I'll touch on in promising programs, is very important because you have some PhD students and graduates who are brought into an environment feeling that success is an academic appointment, a tenure track. And if you do not achieve that, you have somehow failed. And that obviously causes a lot of stress into the system. And these PhD students and graduates are bearing the brunt of that culture on the negative side. And again, as a quote on the next slide, I think this sums up some of certainly what we read and heard. The faculty being unhappy filtered down to us. They had the power to make us unhappy. We know in a PhD, the influence of a PhD student as advisor is huge, guiding them towards academic success, but also shaping expectations and career ambitions. Many of our academics, they themselves have been trained within these environments and are either ill-prepared or in some cases unwilling to help their students transition to non-academic careers, which may require either different skill sets or approaches in how that is framed for other non-academic opportunities. Next slide, please. In terms of extending this, PhD graduates may not be aware of the skills and abilities that they could bring to future employers, or there may be a mismatch between what they have and what employers are looking for. They are holding many jobs over their careers. They need transferable skills as well as the ability to learn new skills and ways of working. PhD graduates have a very clear sense of their knowledge, but they often fail to recognize what skills they have, a so-called skills awareness gap. On the other hand, the private sector recognizes that PhDs do have very highly specialized knowledge, but often see them as lacking adaptability and certain communication and teamwork skills, and perhaps even the ability to collaborate with diverse actors or to incorporate multiple perspectives that cross-disciplinary and societal sector boundaries would require. What's interesting is that in Canada, we talk about the skills mismatch, we talk about the need for talent at the same time when we're talking about PhD graduates facing challenges entering the labor market. Next slide, please. And to sort of capture this through this quote, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm good for. I don't know how to come to terms with the fact that the life I imagined is not going to happen. And we know for many of these PhD students and graduates, it can come very late in their program or even after they complete their studies, that there's this realization that what they thought and what has been expected of them is not going to transpire. Next slide, please. In terms of seeking employment outside of Canada or international students coming into Canada, this is a topic certainly that we looked at. There are some data gaps, I would suggest, in this area. We know the proportion of PhD graduates from Canadian institutions who are international students is growing. It was a quarter of all PhD graduates in 2016. They are mobile, more mobile than domestic students. They have relocated to Canada for their studies, and they have a tendency to be more mobile post-graduation because of their coming from an international background, but also because a higher percentage come from or study in the STEM fields. Mobility is often seen as a requirement for PhDs to seek positions in academia. There's not a lot of data, as I mentioned, but what we did see through some of the surveys is that the primary motivations to move are the prestige of international institutions or researchers and the opportunity to maximize their chances in obtaining an academic position. In terms of Canadian PhDs graduates to leave Canada to look outside of academia, again, from the surveys, it suggests that they're leaving because of sufficiently number of high quality employment opportunities in Canada. And in most cases, they are moving to the United States. Next slide, please. a quote, "Although I would like to be employed in Canada, the science opportunities and the salaries in the US are much more reflective of the overall priority the US places on the value of science compared to the previous Canadian governments and industry." This is from a UBC tracking survey that was done, again, from a graduate who left the country for a better job in the United States. So moving to the next slide, this is chapter 7, where we talk about promising practices and approaches. Very forward-looking and really trying to capture some of the momentum that is happening within our institutions, be it academic institutions, government, and even with industry. And we separated these into 4 areas that I'll just touch on. One is to modernize the PhD program design and academic culture. This is everything from look at alternative theses from the traditional theses, perhaps into other aspects, whether it's peer-reviewed papers or other things that come together to form a thesis. But really, it's also looking at how can we be that much more student-centered, not looking at what's good for the institution, the supervisor. How do we be very student-centered? And there are a number of initiatives. I'll just point out the Public Scholars Initiative at UBC is one example. Secondly, is to support supervisors to improve and expand mentorship for PhD students. So again, trying to help the supervisor who may not have that personal experience, really tackling this head on, having early conversations with PhD students about their career aspirations. Perhaps we've seen programs where a student has 2 supervisors, again, who can expose them to a broader supervisory capacity and experience and networks, but really trying to have those conversations earlier and to mentor the student, not just by the supervisor, but by the institution as well. Thirdly, our transitional initiatives, looking at really trying to increase the support to students and their graduates. Some of these are programs like the Insert Create. You've got things like the MyTax program, Work Integrated Learning, a number of these that are existed to really try to build the relationships between PhD students and graduates and potential employers. So employers can better understand the value of PhD graduates and what they can bring to the table, and the PhDs themselves can understand what is expected of them and how they can frame their experience to be that much more desirable from the private sector, as an example. And fourthly is looking at targeted programs to increase demand amongst non-academic employers. Again, we've seen in the federal government, they have programs to recruit policy leaders. Again, their ability to look at PhDs, to increase those numbers, looking at programs like the Creative Destruction Lab, which is all about entrepreneurship. We see a number of PhDs looking at taking their research and commercializing and actually building companies. So really looking at ways that we can increase that receptor capacity outside of academia, which is going to be critical, again, given the need of Canada and the knowledge intensive industries and certainly the availability of high quality personnel. So in terms of reflections, the next slide, please, we really want to, as a panel, highlight the importance of PhD graduates as a valuable resource to our country. They're facing significant challenges as they enter the labor market. They're having difficulties transitioning to this market. It's a growing concern for the graduates, as well as, of course, for universities, employers, funders, government, and the overall public. We felt as a panel that we have a double duty of care. We talked a lot about this. First is the responsibility for the advancement of PhDs themselves, that they are passionate. They want to make a contribution. They have high expectations of themselves. We need to ensure that the programming and the investment that they are making and we are making in them will be valued and can create value. Second duty of care is to Canada, to the advancement of society, the economy, to our environment. It's very important that we look at our PhDs as a resource for this country. As we grow our knowledge economy, as we talk about the skills shortage, as we need innovation, productivity, and creativity, as Canada really emerges this century as a leader, we need to look at our PhDs as that valuable resource and ensure that we are set up for success for the future. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to you, Eric, for some Q&A and dialogue. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Elizabeth. Judging by the volume of chats and questions that we've got, I think it's fair to say there's considerable interest in what the expert panel had to say and in the stimulating comments that your presentation has raised. We've got a top team working behind the scenes to try and capture as many of the questions that people have been asking, both on the chat and in the Q&A box. I'm going to apologize in advance, as I said before, that we won't be able to get to every single one of the questions. We're going to try and get through as many as we can, as helpfully as we can. And obviously there'll be opportunities to follow up later on. So Elizabeth, I think the easiest thing to do is to begin with sort of a question that I will take from the pile, ask you, and then maybe allow you to give your remarks to it. The first question is, there wasn't mention of the need for PhD graduates in government, in science, policy, finance, the departments of the federal, or one may even suggest the provincial governments. Did the panel consider the demand for PhDs in this sector in addition to the academic and industrial sectors?
Well, as I noted in one of our slides, we did break down where PhD graduates go as a sector, and we lumped into what we call the public sector, which is approximately 10%. And in promising programs, I did mention there is a federal government program that looks to bring on PhD graduates in terms of policy areas. Given that this report was sponsored by the federal government, we hope as a panel, and one would expect that as they look at this and absorb our findings and reflect on perhaps areas where improvements can be made, certainly within government would be sort of a natural extension of things that are being done now. But a lower percentage of GERD is done obviously within the government itself, but it is an important part of it. And I would hope and expect that further opportunities for PhD graduates within the public sector more broadly, provincially, federally, would be under discussion.
Thanks. Another question, and we're sort of taking these in different priorities, try to cover as many of the different topics as possible. Obviously, in a report of this length, there's only so much that you can look at. You already mentioned that there was a timing issue regarding whether to address COVID-19 issues, but just going to the data issue itself. There's some interest, I think, that from our audience about the challenges that your panel faced when putting the report together, gaps that might have existed in the data that, had it been there, it would have been useful. Maybe about the size, there's a slide on tenure track and Canadian versus international recruits. But the main issue is how to think about the gaps or the kind of evidence that may not have been available, and did that affect the outcome of the report itself?
Thanks very much. Certainly, and I think one of the challenges when you for the expert panel is limiting the scope, obviously, to the charge, but also to what is available. And there are a number of gaps, just on the whole postdoctoral fellow side, I would say there's some gaps. Even on PhDs, PhDs leaving Canada, coming back to Canada, that's certainly a challenge. I would say particularly there's lack of data on the EDI side, equity, diversity, and inclusion from underrepresented groups. That was certainly a challenge for us. We, as you noted, I talked about gender, but didn't delve into other underrepresented groups. And frankly, there's not a lot of data there. So I think that's a challenge. And just where do PhDs, where are they employed specifically? How many are in transitional roles? The average length of time it takes to launch a career. These are really important questions that there's not sort of explicit data that we could tackle and include in the report. So all to say, I think it is ripe for further research and investigation.
Thanks. And I can certainly say on behalf of CCA that any report that starts and ends, there will always be the question of, is there something else that could have been said? And hopefully this is the beginning of the conversation on this topic, not the last word. I want to turn to a different kind of question again, this one more about interpersonal training, career assistants, supervisors, and really a question about whether you think the kind of training and career assistance should be part of the training and job duty of a PhD supervisor and graduate departments. What role does that play, and did the committee talk about that?
Absolutely. I think anyone who's done a PhD or been a supervisor, and as I mentioned, it's a very important relationship in terms of establishing the environment that the PhD student is immersed in, setting up those career expectations. And absolutely, I think training and helping our supervisors be better mentors, understanding some of this data, that many of their graduates will not be like them going on to an academic career. And it is our shared responsibility to prepare these graduates for other more diverse employment opportunities is important. There are a number of programs, again, that are in place that are starting to do that. Some of them work with the individual supervisors. Some of them work at the institutional level that PhD graduates can sort of take, workshops and other things. I think what's really important, though, is that this gets institutionalized, that it is sometimes, faculty members as supervisors, they are not as supportive of their PhD students in taking up and making use of these programs that may exist. And to me, this is a shared responsibility, and we need to, again, be student-centric and make sure that we are developing programs, initiative, and approaches that are going to best serve the student, and through the student, our country and society.
Thanks very much. I want to pivot a little bit now. And again, thanks to all of you who are putting questions or comments in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We have, as I say, a team behind the scenes who are capturing them. And if you want to know what happens behind the screen, there's a Google document we're trying to keep going through so I can keep track of them. This is a question really getting to the heart of some of the findings that you described, and maybe you can reflect a little bit more on them, Elizabeth. This relates to really whether and how we are training our PhD graduates for positions outside of academia right now. Is it about industry not recognizing the skills, or the skills not being there? Are there disciplinary differences? I realize you answered a question relating to the role of PhDs in government science, and there are some others about that, but maybe to reflect on positions outside of academia generally, and this skill asynchrony.
Well, I think all of your comments certainly are valid, Eric, in terms of, it's not one thing. If I look at the employer side, We had some interesting briefings from MyTax, for example, who are exactly, that is their program, is to do matches between PhD students, graduates, postdocs, and industry. And in many cases, it's industry not being aware of the total value proposition that a PhD student or graduate brings to the table. Sometimes the vernacular is different in terms of what they know or how they do things. Once they've experienced having a PhD on their team as supported through a MyTax program, the light bulb comes on and it's like, wow, this person can really add value to our organization, and we want to keep them. Part of it lies, I think, on the PhD graduates themselves of the mental framework around how do they take their knowledge and skills and put it in a rubric, if you will, that is going to be interesting, desirable for industry. In many cases, and we heard this through some of the stories, that a PhD student goes through their program not even thinking, perhaps till very late in the game, that this academic career is not going to work out. And then it's a matter of, okay, now what do I do? And getting support to round out their knowledge, but reframing their knowledge and skills in a way that is going to position them better to other employers is key. Putting specific programs in place, and we've seen a number of them and talked about them in the report. What is it working in teamwork? What is it working in a basic sort of functions within a company or an organization? Communication skills. All of the things that perhaps somebody who gets a bachelor's degree hits at 21, some of our PhD graduates aren't sort of experienced until their mid-30s. And so how do you take what you do have and reframe it? And then how do you add layers to what you have before you graduate or shortly after you graduate to add to your knowledge base and skill set? So it's both. I think this is not a, one side is doing it right and the other side just isn't figuring it out. It's really having those conversations and the linkages between this tremendous knowledge base and resource of our PhD graduates and their tremendous need, within our private sector, as an example, to innovate and to drive their companies forward. And so, again, I'll point to MyTax as one exemplar of that, but there are others out there as well that are really trying to really pull down these silos to better utilize our PhD graduates.
I think you've also alluded to something, not to put words in your mouth, but the demographic and economic shifts in society clearly were uppermost, or if not uppermost, certainly on the mind of the panel. Where, I'm finishing reading the book, The 100-Year Life right now. Others might have read it as well, looking at, someone born today or in the last 5 or 6 years has a very good chance of living to 100. Which is sort of a phenomenal idea, which sort of changes the way you think about the old 3-siloed life of education and then knowledge application and then retirement. But I'm wondering whether you could maybe go one step further with that question that we've just asked, and say a bit more about the various silos and whether they intersect. We've had a couple questions now about industry. There was a question earlier about government. Would you like to say anything about the academic environment itself, lest we think that this is all a rush to find places other than the academy to work? Hardly. That's certainly not the main message of the report. But would you reflect both as a former president and as a scholar in your own right, what the future of the academy is with respect to its own best practices? Are there universities, you don't have to name them, but are there places who seem to be doing it well? Are there examples of leading practices on the academy side?
Well, it's a great question, Eric, and one that the expert panel discussed quite a bit, because all of these programs, that I mentioned and are talked about in the report, and I'll come back to those, to try to have our PhD students and graduates having more opportunities to be better utilized in terms of the resource outside of academia. those have benefit inside academia as well. Better teamwork, better communication, better project management. And I can say that as a university president, from a university president. Those are all beneficial to the academic environment. And what I hope, and certainly we discussed around the panel in the context of academic culture, that it continually evolves, that the responsibility that a supervisor sees, their duty to their PhD students, their role in assisting that PhD who is investing their time and energy in a significant part of their productive life in their studies, the supervisor really should be improving their ability to support the students. And I think, we're going to start, starting to see it shift. Some of those expectations changing within our academic institutions with respect to supervisory duties, assessing the quality of supervision of our faculty, recognizing those who are doing it well, because the academy itself has to change. And I think as part of the sponsors, obviously it's the federal government, but that is inclusive of the funding agencies, the Tri-Council, and I know they're very strongly interested in these findings because it's part of an ecosystem. The funding agencies support and in some cases really validate that academic culture through their committees and who's comprised in those committees. So we all have to work together to see how we can best support our PhDs, whether they're going into the academy or whether they are looking at opportunities outside. There's lots of great examples. I mean, some of them we touched on in the report. At UBC, there's some great examples. We have the wonderful work that's happening through McGill in some of their programs, but some of the research they're doing in the humanities. That is so important because sometimes this is more obvious, to lack of a better word, in the STEM disciplines. But when you have the humanities as a discipline coming to the table and saying, okay, what are we doing and how do we do this differently to support our PhD graduates? That opens up the conversation and starts to change the academic culture. And it's when, from the top, sitting at the top of the institution, you can only do so much. It has to start from within. It has to start at ground level. And that's what we hope this report does.
Again, super. I realize it was a broad question, but I think better to ask the broad question and give you room to roam on it. I'm going to take another one that sort of shifts us not from the inside of the country outside. We know that you did have a consideration of the international sort of perspective on this. And I wonder if you can comment on how Canada is or is not different from other countries in terms of the challenges of the PhDs transitioning into the labor market. I realize this is a much larger topic than what this panel undertook. I can certainly remind the audience that CCA has undertaken a number of assessments that looks at Canada's competitiveness internationally with respect to science and technology and STEM and where we are with our capacity to produce scholarship and the like. But just wondering maybe, Elizabeth, if you can reflect on other countries. Australia comes to mind, but certainly our friends in the UK, I think, are watching this presentation. Lessons learned from other places, how Canada compares. Maybe just give us a flavor of the international dimension to this topic.
Well, I think part of it starts is how's Canada different? And as I mentioned in the presentation, if you look at things like our GERD as a percentage of GDP, we are not just lagging the US significantly, we're lagging the average of the OECD, and we're declining. So that is a bigger conversation than just PhD graduates, but it certainly pulls in and supports some of the dynamics that we're seeing. And also sort of within that, where is the R&D being conducted? And we know it's more heavily weighted to universities than it is to the private sector relative to other jurisdictions as well. So we we have more work to do than some other countries that are, certainly been more adaptive. I think, some of the quotes that we mentioned in the presentation, the US is a huge pull for PhD graduates from almost every other country, not just Canada, because of the ecosystem and the value that is placed on a PhD within that environment. And we've seen some interesting work coming out of Australia, where part of the challenge is many jobs, they may be advertised. They don't say we need a PhD. So how do you match, if somebody has a PhD, how can that person understand if they're even sort of qualified or could be a contributor to that role? So there's some work that's happening in Australia, a pilot to sort of look at job advertisements and say, yes, this would be appropriate for a PhD. It's helpful for the company, but it's helpful for the PhD, because that's, I think, one of our challenges here as well, of being able to look at that. So we didn't do an extensive look at other countries. We have some examples, for example, out of Edinburgh University in the UK, looking at new supervision models and having 2 supervisors, things like that. But to me, I've even had, since we've released the reports and chats with people outside the country, a huge amount of interest in this report, because I think everybody's feeling it to certain degrees. Canada just has some very specific aspects to its economy and to particularly its research enterprise that is going to make it even more challenging for us.
Well, thank you for that answer. And sadly, that's going to have to be the last one. We've actually gone a few minutes over, which we understand is a good sign because there's a lot of interest online. Elizabeth, I want to thank you for providing the overview of this panel's report. I again want to thank CAGS for its partnering with us. I'm sure there's going to be more work that we'll do together. There'll be follow-up and next steps. I'd like to thank everybody for the opportunity. I'm going to turn it back over to Ian. Ian, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Eric, and to Dr. Cannon. What a wonderful presentation. The chat menu is absolutely filled with comments and engagement, and the questions I see have reached 45. So this is an incredible session. I think we could have gone for 2 or 3 hours, but unfortunately our next session is coming up. So I will pass things over to Marty for her final words of thanks.
Good, thank you, Ian. Well, first, huge thanks to Elizabeth for a fabulous presentation, to Eric for hosting this event today, and also to the expert panel that put it all together. I found myself nodding away by myself here at my desk to almost everything that was said. And I also like the whole angle that the report took, which was not about cutting the number of PhDs, but finding places for them all to land and be successful. And I think we all have some work to do, just like you said. It'll come from all sectors, but we'll get there. I found it really inspiring. So thank you so much. And thanks to all of the audience who joined us today. Really hope you got the same thing out of it I did, which I'm sure you did. So thank you, take care. And for those who are at the CAGS conference, you can have a few minutes to catch the 3MT video before we move to our next session. See you later.